Even though we are located in different parts of the world, I would like to formally begin our event today by acknowledging that the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. We here at UBC are very grateful to be able to carry out our work on this land. Today's webinar with Professor Shelly Chen is part of the City Reassembled series, a series of seminars, conversations, and associated events to explore the past, present, and future of the Hong Kong diaspora. This webinar and the series in general is organized by the UBC Hong Kong Studies Initiative and is co-sponsored by the Department of Asian Studies, the Department of History, the Center for Chinese Research, the Center for Migration Studies, Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies, the UBC Public Humanities Hub, and the Interdisciplinary Histories Research Cluster. We are very grateful for our colleagues' support. Today, in addition to Professor Chen, we have also invited Professor Diana Larry to serve as a respondent and to help kickstart our discussion after the presentation. Professor Larry is Professor Emerita of History and former Director of the Center for Chinese Research at UBC. She's a prolific historian of modern China. Her latest book, I think, is coming out in April. And she has been a strong and steadfast supporter of the Hong Kong Studies Initiative from day one, having herself led the Canada and Hong Kong project in Toronto from 1990 to 2005. I should add that it dawned on me one day that it would make perfect sense to ask Professor Diana Larry to join us today for a reunion of sort, because as some of you might know, Professor Larry was Professor Chen's MA supervisor at UBC. Finally, I know I have spoken for too long already. I'm joined here today by Ryan Sun, a PhD candidate in the Department of History at UBC, who is currently doing research on a dissertation on the lived experiences of Austrian and German Jewish refugees who found themselves not in Shanghai, where much attention has been given to, but in wartime Hong Kong or Singapore. Ryan will serve as the moderator for today's event and will now introduce Professor Chen. Over to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Dr. Shen. Welcome, everyone. Dr. Shelly Chen is an associate professor of modern Chinese history at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her research focuses on the rise and disappearance of Nanyang, the Southern Seas, a migrant and oceanic geography connecting China and Southeast Asia from the 18th to the 20th centuries. Her recent book, Diasporas, Homeland, Modern China in the Age of Global Migration, was published in 2018 and shortlisted for the International Convention for Asian Studies Humanities Book Prize in 2019. It adopts a transnational framework merging the distinct scholarships of Chinese overseas, Chinese Americans, and modern China to offer a new transnational understanding of Chinese history. Her book's concept of diaspora moment raises the question of how the diaspora informs and impacts the politics of the homeland. In today's talk, Professor Chen continues with her investigation onto the diaspora, exploring its implications with the field of Hong Kong studies and the place of Hong Kong. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Professor Shelly Chen.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Leo, Diana, for being here. I am so honored and thrilled to be given this talk. As you have heard, I was a student at UBC, both BA and MA, and so this is a coming home of sorts. Sorry, talking about diaspora, these common tropes of leaving and coming back. So I'm very excited to reconnect with the UBC community and talking to a Canadian audience. This is an opportunity I was looking forward to. So my talk today, and as you've heard, I'm not a Hong Kong scholar, and I want to say this not because I think I have nothing to offer. I do think I have a little bit to offer here, but I think those who have been working on Hong Kong, in their careers, based on whether they're based in Hong Kong or elsewhere, have produced some of the finest, most outstanding scholarship of his history and culture, society, so on and so forth. And so here I'm just hoping to join this conversation, as there's so many of us hope to bring attention and awareness to Hong Kong at this present moment. And so I hope I could contribute in that regard by sharing some things that I recognized about diaspora and Hong Kong at the present moment, and outline something more like a research agenda, a set of research questions for those who might be interested in related questions. So I hope I would be helpful today, but I want to really say that I do not work on Hong Kong. Instead, I rely on the scholarship, the excellent scholarship that's produced by scholars who work on Hong Kong. And we really appreciate their efforts. And I think I can say on behalf of a lot of people, and some of you might actually be in the audience. And I'm very glad to see some names I recognize. So thanks for joining us on a Friday afternoon in Pacific time and other times elsewhere. So, all right, let me get started with what I have prepared for you. For some reason, I found my button. There we go. Let's see. All right. Just 1 second. Let me get this sorted out first. I was testing it just now, and I forgot to go back to the original screen. All right, can you all see my screen, my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Excellent. So my talk today is called What is Diaspora? A Possible Dialogue with Hong Kong Studies. So we try to kind of go back to the basics of just making sure that we understand some of the qualities, some of the most iconic interpretations about diaspora, and what somebody like me and my colleagues have done on Chinese migration and diaspora, and open this up for a set of research questions and avenues, hopefully for others to join us, or for us to also join them. So, so this is more a kind of a suggestive kind of talk, and hopefully it will be useful. So a Hong Kong diaspora, this is something that I have personally noticed, and casually tracking events, and not in a very serious manner as a scholar, but kind of as a concerned person. Just watching news recently about Hong Kong in recent years, and something has popped up and caught my attention, and there's discussions about a Hong Kong diaspora. So this phrase has not been used before. I think very often at all in until recent years, and so naturally I became interested. So the Chinese terms for it, one is 海外港人, 海外港人. Right? So the focus is on the fact that these are Hong Kong people or Hong Kongers who are located overseas. A sense of them at a different location, but somehow there's some sort of integrity about that, so that it warrants a label or a collective description about them, right? Despite the various different locations they are, being overseas of Hong Kong. The other term is 離散港人, 離散港人, right? So that has been kind of more recently used, I think. That it might have been a kind of a borrowing from the Taiwanese use of such terms, a diasporic term, that has the focus is placed on a scattering, a movement, 离散, right? 离散. So departure and scattering, dispersion of Hong Kongers or Hong Kong people. So the focus is on the movement, I think, and rather than just simply location. So that has been something that has intrigued me, being a historian of migration and diaspora. So I want to begin with some of the reports that I read. They're particularly heart-wrenching about the current state of Hong Kong. There's more than one thing that is going on in Hong Kong right now, but here I'm just going to focus on the departures, the painful discussions about leaving Hong Kong that are happening in a lot of living rooms of families in Hong Kong right now or in recent years. And especially was picking up in the last couple years since the 2019 protests. So this is a particular set of report from Reuters that I noticed. And so this is a story about a family. The women, as we see on the left here, is a mother of 3 daughters. And she and her husband made a very difficult decision to leave Hong Kong for Scotland, a place that they have never really lived or seen before. What they were doing is to bring their children with them and hoping for a more stable future where their children would have less fear of, kind of political restrictions that they felt are being like thrown at them. And also that they are making a decision to leave behind family relatives, including their own aging parents. So it seems like that these have been in the news for the last couple of years of the departures that are happening in the homes and at the airports of in Hong Kong. So pictures of this Mrs. Lai is enjoying cooking from her mother, and also her mother was kind of obviously didn't want to their daughter, her daughter and her grandchildren to leave, and it was all kind of really agonizing for the family to be going through. And here's Mrs. Lai on the right saying goodbye to some friends as well. Friends that she had known for many years, and knowing that by leaving Hong Kong would make it very difficult to have the same kind of relationship without some effort. So this is the family, right, standing, just right in front of this most photographed skylines in the world, right at the Victorian Harbor, and saying, the final goodbye to the families, the relatives, and these, I've seen a lot of pictures of these different families doing the same thing. And for those of us who are immigrants, I came from such a family. My family came to Vancouver in the 1990s, and every immigrant family would have a bunch of these photographs that were taken at the old airport, not this one, at Kaida Airport, and waving, crying, and knowing their lives would not be the same again. All right, there's another report that caught my eye, and that is about how much money is being shifted out of Hong Kong and landed here in Canada. And this is a little snippet of that report. Capital flows out of Hong Kong reaching Canada rose to their highest levels on record last year, with about 43.6 billion Canadian dollars, and that is 34.8 billion US dollars in electronic funds transfers recorded by FinTrack, Canada's anti-money laundering agency, which receives reports on transfers above $10,000 Canadian. So because Canada was trying to track money laundering activities, it has a pretty good record of money that was being shipped out of Hong Kong into Canada, into what is probably seen as a safer harbor now for large sums of money. And so we see not just the outflows of people and families with children leaving behind grandparents, but also some of the families with richer means, right? Investors, perhaps, they're also taking their money out of Hong Kong. And that is a picture of, I believe, a grocery market in Richmond. Another thing I saw was this report about how Hong Kong communities in Canada are helping with these new immigrants with their knowledge and their local experience about where to find jobs or put their children in schools and get other sorts of help. So here's something I found. Right, Reuters was interviewing somebody whose name was Ho, and a 38-year-old man who said, "We are in a battle. These are my comrades, people who share the same values. Who is going to provide that helping hand if I'm not going to?" So feeling a strong affinity and culturally and also politically with these new migrants that found themselves in Canada from the people that had this experience before. Ho, who came to Canada as a teenager before Britain handed Hong Kong back to China in 1997, is just one person helping the network of support groups that have been formed in Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, and Edmonton in the past 2 years. So this moment was also calling out the existing communities of Hong Kong people, Hong Kongers, to pay attention, to show sympathy and offer help to the new groups that are arriving in these different cities where the heavily populated Hong Kong communities. And then there's another one. This is a picture of Aberdeen Center. About a story of another family. And this time, this is a family that is kind of walking in the same footsteps of their parents. This is a woman, last name is Law, a former flight attendant. For her, history has repeated itself. She is part of a rare cohort of double political emigrants. What that means is that she was taken to Vancouver when she was 12 by her parents, and she remembers daily speaker phone calls from the living room with her father, who was earning the family bread as a hotel chef back in Hong Kong. So astronaut family, right? So this is a child, an astronaut family who came probably in the 80s or 90s. And now she's bringing her own children to Vancouver. When I was young, I asked my father why I had to move, but now I'm in his position. I understand, she said. He sacrificed more than we did. He's the one who had to be alone. So this is someone who grew up, right, having that experience and returned to Hong Kong. And then in the middle age, in the 30s or 40s, now with children in tow, taking them back to Canada. So I believe this is a quite common story. I have my own friends who are undergoing this sort of experience. And so there's a certain intergenerational quality of the diasporic experience that was not a one-off thing. There's a serial quality that not only puts you in the experience of your family, your parents or grandparents, but also with others who had the same experience coming from Hong Kong at different times in the past. So of course, Canada is not the only place that was being affected or undergoing, and seeing these arrivals of new immigrants from Hong Kong. Taiwan is another site where a lot of this is happening. And we see political activists, protesters that were continuing that work and printing the magazine Wu Shui or Yu Sui, Flow Hong Kong from Taiwan. And then, of course, there's the UK. There's Hong Kongers who were organizing themselves socially and politically in Britain. So what we are seeing, if I could summarize what I found, just by my own kind of news clipping of sorts, that diaspora represents a Hong Kong diaspora at this present moment represents a distinct yet diverse set of experiences. These are at this moment often middle-class families who had some sort of economic means to allow them to uproot themselves, and also taking advantage of the different immigration and policies or visa relaxation that is provided to them in Canada, UK, or Australia. But they also spoke of a diverse set of experiences, not just among these families, but among other Hong Kongers or previous generation of Hong Kong immigrants that were part of this experience. The sense of rupture and continuation, I think the story of the mother who was herself, when she was younger, she was a child that did not make a decision herself, but her parents were thinking for her for the future, that brought her to Vancouver, while the parents, the father stayed in Hong Kong. And after she grew up, she moved back to Hong Kong and thought this might be the end of that experience. And unexpectedly, it wasn't turned out to be. And she's now, kind of almost following in the footsteps of her father and doing the same thing with her own children. So a sense of rupture and continuation kind of coexists in this moment, that it seems like it's a big shift. But in other sense, it seems like something had already been set in motion earlier. The needs and capacities for autonomy and community are quite evident, I think, and it's just really exude these reports that the uncertainty, or maybe the worries and fear of leaving everything you've known your entire life, your careers that you built, the relationships that you built, and the needs to actually find the sense of autonomy and freedom that you feel you deserve and your children deserve, looking for that autonomy, and also having the needs for community, right? Accepting help, wanting to find help, wanting to feel settled and belonged, and the capacity to do that, to survive and to go on. All of that seem to be all existing in this experience that we're looking at. So what I'd like to do for the rest of the webinar is to kind of use this as a point of departure, and going to what I said, like the basic, just what is diaspora? If we take it out of the Hong Kong context and into other ones, where a lot of people have studied it and really thought a lot about it, added a lot of new things to it by considering different cultural experiences and historical experiences. What do we have, and what can we draw on to study, Hong Kong? So that's my goal, right? What is diaspora, and what may diaspora teach us about Hong Kong, right? And instead of thinking, kind of and also kind of the question of what may Hong Kong teach us about diaspora, instead of thinking, kind of how we just apply the concept of diaspora to the Hong Kong experience, and our job will be done. I think more importantly, it's to think about, by thinking through Hong Kong, what kind of contribution that we can offer to diaspora studies, and in turn also help us shed some light on things that would have been invisible in the Hong Kong experience. So I think this kind of dialogue could often be very productive and rewarding, And hopefully, I will show, a little bit of how I think it could be done. What is diaspora? So a bit about genealogy, but I don't want to be too constrained by it. But let's just start from the beginning. I think the word itself means scattering. A sowing of seeds is a Greek word, but it's used often to describe Jewish people, right? The word itself, the sowing of seeds, scattering of seeds, describe dispersion, right? So that's the first thing we need to remember, that it describes movement as dispersion, right? There's certainly other ways to understand movement, maybe unidirectional movement or multi-directional movement. But I think for diaspora, the most basic idea is the idea about dispersion. So often drawing into conversation the origin and the destination or multiple destinations together and see them as a collective. So as I've said before, and probably a lot of you are aware, it's a word that was used to describe the scattering of the Jewish people after the destruction of Jerusalem in around 600 BCE. So we're talking about diasporas existing as a very ancient word and heavily associated with the idea of exile, forced dispersion, oppression, genocide, discrimination, right? Almost people would think, really a sense of victimization, victimhood is deeply kind of shaping the meaning of this word. Enslavement. The African diaspora, personally, I'm very indebted to the scholarship about the African diaspora, and the Black Atlantic, of course, is one of the classics in this field. It's kind of like the it can help contribute to this explosion of the use of the word diaspora. It's very evocative because it also talks about kind of the use of diaspora to describe the African experience of enslavement and forced dispersion, right, all throughout the Atlantic and the Caribbean, and gave us so much of the culture, right, that we identify, as world culture these days, even. So kind of jazz, for example. So I think the Black Atlantic, to see that movements across the Atlantic and then shaping a type of culture and shared experiences that is rooted in the experience of slavery for African communities is a kind of one of the earliest kind of ideas in the 1990s that helped contribute to this phenomenon of a very vibrant and complicated scholarship about diaspora. So not giving justice to all of it yet, but I think I should move on. Trade. So another frequent use about diaspora that is connected with Chinese people is about the trade diasporas that are often linked to the Chinese. It's about the junk trade, the Chinese junk trade, from southeastern part of China to many parts of Southeast Asia, linking of the different coasts into one region. Then also it's about the recruitment and active invitation of Chinese diasporic merchants and traders to contribute to local state formation, develop the economy, clear up farmland, and participate in mining activities that would bring lucrative incomes to local states. Right, this whole phenomenon of how Chinese were not just welcomed but recruited throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries to work and live in parts of Southeast Asia was also part of this story. Right, these long-distance merchants who had to live around a schedule of monsoon winds that would have them leave home for several months at a time and the sojourning that happened, right? That followed the schedule of the monsoon winds of when you can leave home and expect to go back with your ship laden with goods. So that's also something, you know, that comes from the Chinese experience. And here, this is a book about, you know, a kind of a collection from the 90s, Chinese diaspora, of kind of as a way, an umbrella concept to bring together Chinese in different national locations, from Canada, from US, from Australia, Southeast Asian, different countries, and try to assemble in such a way that kind of to articulate their experience of being away and also settled and becoming local citizens, contribute to local societies. So these are some of the familiar tropes for those of us who spend a lot of time thinking about migration and diaspora. Now, we have also used the diaspora as a term very broadly now. It's you know, these might be the Jewish or the Armenian or the Greek diasporas, African diaspora, Chinese diaspora. Maybe these are the ideal types. But we've also used you know, kind of diasporic, you know, this term more loosely to attach to different things, so that we're not confined by these cultural types. And even Chinese experiences are not just constrained to trade experience, being a trader or a merchant. There's a lot more going on. So diasporic communities, networks is the more frequent, familiarly explored phenomenon these days. Since the 1990s, where this is that explosion of diaspora scholarship, and a focus on decentered lateral connections. So how these different ports or communities are connected with each other, rather than, you know, in the context of my research, just with China, right? Or China, not China as a whole, but pieces, slithers of China, pieces of other places, and put them together. So we don't no longer use nation states necessarily as the unit to start from or come back to, but we look for other combinations, other arrangements. Would it make sense to say, for example, talk about Hong Kong and Vancouver and San Francisco? Yes, indeed, and Hawaii, for example. So these are some of the other uses of diaspora that have become very common and very productive these days. Other tropes, iconic expressions and descriptions that's associated with diaspora. You know, we understand migration as a type of displacement. It's involved communities or individuals who are dislocated from their original homes, and thinking, you know, kind of experiencing alienation, longing, nostalgia, and this might be carried through generations. So even those who had not had that first experience of departure might actually rediscover diaspora as a familiar, as a useful term or expression to describe their own experience. Return, right? This is sometimes just a kind of permanently delayed and deferred idea that in the back of the mind of somebody who who can be diasporic, they think someday they will return to where they used to be or they come from, right? To a real or imagined homeland, maybe sometimes a homeland they've never seen or been to. So this is a return to a real imagined homeland, but often sometimes deferred, right? That never happened, but it becomes a kind of something that was only helping the construction of an identity or agenda, or a way to describe a sentiment. Hybridity, the mixing of cultural elements and rearranging them in different orders, combining them in different ways. I think that's something, could be, kind of living in Vancouver or Hong Kong, you're quite familiar with these things, that they're not really just one thing or the other, but a combination, right? So in California, where I am, for example, food culture is one big, example of hybridity, where you can mix Korean bulgogi with Mexican tacos, right? So it's making us hungry. I'll just stay away from food for a while, but you know what I mean. And bubble tea, for example, just kind of is phenomenon of leaving, right? Its original place of, say, Taiwan, and going to different places and mixing local elements, it becomes something different and almost universal, right? So it's very much less about keeping the culture the way it was. And although this kind of claim is often present in a lot of diaspora communities, they want to keep the culture the same way as it used to be. But chances are it would always undergo change and mixing to stay relevant. And of course, one of my favorite, and probably you've heard of this too, some of you at least, roots and routes came from diaspora studies, right? So I think it's a field that is just so inspirational and just giving us additional tools to describe experience that often escape the language of the nation state. Roots and routes. So the idea is that as people who are in diaspora or see themselves as being a member of it, we often sometimes encountering questions about who we are, where we're from, right? Or even just being Asian, right? In Canada or here in the US. Instead of asking what are people's roots, we ought to think about what are their routes, the different points by which they have come to be now. They are, in a sense, the sum of those differences. So instead of just being so obsessed about where people are from, where their parents are from, we ought to kind of also pay attention. What really matters is that what people have done, right, after leaving, or just think about the different routes, the different pathways that shape that person. So it's the routes that matter, right? According to Stuart Hall, a scholar of post-colonial Marxist scholar from based in the UK, himself a Jamaican a person who's really an iconic person of cultural studies. Now, it's not just theorists that shape diaspora studies. I think historians too, and historians who are kind of have a transnational and global bent, especially, would find diaspora useful as a way to capture certain things that would have been left invisible in national histories. So this is the kind of movements that have been happening for centuries. So our theorists of the diaspora studies will often say, all this kind of diasporic movements and networks have only started to happen in the 1990s because they're very focused on the phenomenon of globalization and global capitalism. But for historians like myself, we know that it has been going on for longer than that. And this is just one snapshot of something that's very human and very universal, that people have been moving in large numbers for long periods of time. So you might recognize this, the 12 million people, this is the enslaved African peoples that for a period of 400 years, that they have been brought to different places across the Atlantic. All right, so that gave rise to a lot of scholarship about the African diaspora. And then you have Europeans also sailing across the Atlantic, the Atlantic across to the Americas. And even though you see 32 million people, but a lot of that number, a majority happened during the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries, right? What is known as the age of global migration was coined by Adam McEwen. And for China, we just look, I hope you can see my cursor here. Around 20 million people were also moving long distance from southeastern part of China overseas, especially to Southeast Asia, but also then about 1 million across the Pacific to different places, to Hawaii, to Australia, to the US, Canada, and other places, Latin America. So, Chinese people, Chinese migration was very much a global phenomenon that was shared. If we look at things in just very narrow national terms, we don't see these connections, these shared phenomena. And I think this is something that is quite useful for us to kind of for historians to draw attention to. Now, I'm not the only person who do this kind of work. Certainly building on a previous generation of scholars, and Daniel Larry, certainly my teacher, was doing that for quite a while. And but there is a kind of, I feel like a kind of a renaissance of sorts about Chinese migration diaspora, and a lot of this was also kind of Asia-based scholarship. So some of you would know that Dominic Yang, who also kind of was one of UBC students. So his book about the great exodus of Chinese people, or later called mainlanders, who moved across the Taiwan Strait to Taiwan, at the time of the Civil War and after the Second World War. So his very excellent study is just full of the stories of hardship and suffering and reinvention, survival and growth, all of that transformation that happened in the second half of the 20th century. And my another colleague, Tamo Zhou, was also written a very excellent book that's received a lot of praise and attention. Very happy for her. A Migration in a Time of Revolution is to bring together the communities in Indonesia that's going through the period of independence from Dutch colonial rule, and also getting caught and in the Civil War, the struggle between the nationalists and communists, a very complicated, volatile situation. And the stories about some of these people who were in Indonesia, or that they did not live, never lived in China, but thought that they have to return to China, right? So some of their experiences. Another book by Wayne Sun, Global Medicine in China, he looks at intellectuals, especially those who are medically trained professionals who were often trained in the US, and they came back to China, and they have lots of ambition and knowledge about modernizing Chinese medicine, and how some of that was taken to Taiwan, again, because of this great migration, also the retreat of the nationalist government to Taiwan. So, a lot is going on. I think it's just is a fortunate time to be in the company of scholars who are studying similar things. So Chinese migration diaspora, what are some of the things that we could bring to the study, highlight, right? Culture and identity. For example, how diaspora is the basis of creating a new kind of culture and new kind of identity for the people involved. You probably heard, by being in Canada and the US, or having visited these places, right? These are terms that are, kind of speaking of migrant experience of not being in China, right? So Tangren, for example, right? Tongyan. Chinatown is actually not called Chinatown in Chinese. It's not 中国城. It's not 中国城 or something. It's Tangren, right? So this is a kind of diasporic term that's not specific to Canada, but to the communities that were moving around across Pacific, for example. I don't have time to actually get into all of these terms, but I just want to show these. So place, for example, Gold Mountains, South Seas, these are not national categories. They don't refer to specific countries, but how migrants imagined the territory, the places they're visiting, right? So Gold Mountain could equally be Canada, be the US, or places in Australia. South Seas could be anywhere in Southeast Asia. And Henry Yu, for example, also based at UBC, he has this concept about Cantonese Pacific, I'm sorry. So to have this kind of a single term that could capture, kind of these movements and also the different rhythms in which they work together, right, as a network. So I think that's also very useful for a lot of us. Time, and I have, kind of think about, how to get away from just national-based periodizations, that we have to talk about time in a certain manner to track all the political campaigns or shift of governments, but how do, kind of diaspora communities that created a lot of connections between China and other places experience time. So this is something I could get back to at the end, but I just wanted to kind of just briefly introduce thinking about time and rhythms and how certain things force China to engage with the diaspora at certain moments, but not at others. So all these amount to a critical perspective on the nation state as a standard unit of analysis, that as scholars, we are so invested in explaining the nation state that we force everything through it. And that we are missing sight of other things that are not just coming in our borders, but how borders themselves don't explain much, right? Or they are just artificial creations. State-centered narratives that are so deeply concerned with China is the Chinese government or Chinese state at any given period, and missing, kind of people-centered narratives. So state-centered narratives are often not quite the same as people-centered narratives that track social and cultural phenomenon, people, money, goods going in and out of China. So in dialogue with Hong Kong studies, how to bring what I just said into Hong Kong studies, and picture of Bruce Lee here reminds us how he's not a figure that could be explained exclusively as an American or a Hong Kong person. So it calls for something else, right? That could be that could really encapsulate his life and his career. So diaspora as a force of its own right, and it creates things. It creates, like, for example, Bruce Lee, his very short life, four movies, created such a sensation and a thematic language, right? And so diaspora is not just about destruction and agony and pain, but often it is also a way of life, and also a basis to create culture and identity that is, that could be quite moving. But of course, not everybody lives the life of Bruce Lee. So we've got to remember, of course, there are social differences, what opportunities were available to some groups and not others. And they're very complex. Often these people do not necessarily share the same values with each other, or do not necessarily like each other, or had the same experiences that made them, kind of think of themselves and others in the same ways. So I want to share, some of the memorable, things that we know of Hong Kong as a place by drawing on Hong Kong scholars. The space of disappearance. So kind of the idea that Hong Kong is always on the verge of disappearing, and this is a book by Abbas of an earlier point. It was about 1997, right? That back then there was already a lot of discussion. Hong Kong is disappearing. This is the end. And so the attention that's being drawn to Hong Kong creates a culture there's a lot of talk and attention about Wong Kar-wai's movies or Stanley Kwan's movies and its architecture, so everything became culture, right? So this culture of disappearance, ironically, create an explosive interest that see itself, infused in a lot of discussions about Hong Kong. So anticipated end of Hong Kong as people knew it was the beginning of a profound concern with its historical and cultural specificity. But then the cause of its interest may also cause its demise. Edge of empires. Another way to describe Hong Kong is that it is this small place that is kind of squished by big, powerful forces, right? On the edge of empires. But John Carroll gives us a very interesting and important, read on that position. In the century after the Opium War, upper-class Chinese collaborated with their British rulers to build a place that these Chinese came to consider their own. This collaboration resulted not from colonial governance, but from the initiative and endeavor of the rising Chinese bourgeoisie, and shaped by Hong Kong's strategic, geographical, political, and cultural position at the edge of the Chinese and British empires. So the simple binary understanding of the colonizer and colonized, one is oppressing the other, is not adequate in understanding Hong Kong. Is that something very complex is going on, and both the Chinese Empire and the British Empire relied on this bourgeoisie, this upper Chinese elite for both to achieve the goals they have in mind. Another kind of useful way of thinking about Hong Kong that I can bring in with what I said about diasporas in between place from Elizabeth Sinn. So she, in kind of understanding, has done, her entire career, very admire her for her scholarship, was about the migration that's coming out of Hong Kong across the Pacific, right? So this process of repeated, even continuous movement hubs, right, like Hong Kong, arise and provide appropriate conditions, allowing sojourners to leave and travel far and wide, while also furnishing them with a variety of means to maintain ties with the home village. If Hong Kong may be described as an in-between place, like San Francisco and Bangkok, Singapore and Sydney, how different would migration maps look if instead of simply covering country A and country B, we were to identify all the nodes, the in-between places through which migrants pass and in which they reside temporarily or settle for good after they leave home. So Hong Kong itself is quite unique. It's this in-between place where things pass through, make connections, work. But it's also could be seen in the company of other places that play similar role. And so it's also less unique in other ways. That it's, at least that's how I would interpret her observation. So a Hong Kong diaspora. So I just kind of at the beginning of this the talk show you some news that I was reading about Hong Kong. So I gathered that what diaspora happening at the moment in Hong Kong was something that includes these characteristics: distinct, diverse set of experiences, and a sense of both rupture, but also continuation, just picking up and continuing again, needs and capacities for autonomy and community. So I want to answer my own question that I posed, a pretty ambitious one that I also hope others would help answer to. What may Hong Kong teach us about diaspora? One thing I find just from drawing on the Hong Kong scholars that I so admire, diaspora can be seen as a positionality rather than ethnicity. A lot of the conversations we have within Chinese diaspora studies is that we want to disentangle, our identity as always Chinese and always traceable to China, right? Is there another way to think about our identity? So I think being outside is actually something quite important here. It's about not just being Chinese or being Hong Konger, but just being outside of it, real or imagined homeland. It's a kind of a productive way to think about oneself. I'm outside of this home, right, or this homeland, maybe outside of Hong Kong. So it's more about being outside than simply being Chinese. It's less about intentionality. I think this also comes back to some of the resistance within Chinese diaspora studies, that we need to distinguish who's being forced to leave and who's really actively making a choice to leave. And I think in the case of Hong Kong, it's very hard to say. I do know, kind of in other cases, it's quite clear, right? If you have a refugee population coming from Vietnam in an earlier decade, right? Or Afghanistan more recently, that's something very clear. But in other places, it's not so clear, right? For those who are children that did not make decision to leave, and that they also come from middle-class backgrounds, it's whether they are willing or not, therefore qualified of being called a diaspora or not, isn't quite useful, according to me. Now, what may diaspora teach us about Hong Kong? Well, I think teaching us where Hong Kong is specific and unique, and where isn't. It really has some shared connections and similarities with other places. And that is that we can do so by asking how it produces and is produced by diasporic movements, communities, and networks. So this is something that can be clearly done by, about New York, for example, about San Francisco, about other cities, how it produces and it produced by, influenced by diasporic movements, communities, and networks. But also locating the moments in which Hong Kong rises as a site of junctures or disjunctures in its relationship with a homeland or a diaspora. So this is something that I've written a bit about myself, kind of as a way to think about how we conceive of time and periodization, chronology, temporality. That is, it could be that speaking of a Hong Kong diaspora does not make sense for all times, but it makes sense at certain times when there is a lot of tension, when time suddenly moves very fast. When there's supposed to be a timetable for a unification, that timetable falls off track, and 50 years no more, right? Kind of so the kind of the change of speed of time, the future is already here. That is the kind of temporal disjuncture that Hong Kong people are experiencing, I believe, in its relationship with China, in this moment of unity and fragmentation, and maybe in the future with its own diaspora, right? So kind of just paving the way to think about Hong Kong itself and the Hong Kong diaspora. What might the future relationship look like? Chances are they don't move on the same speed, and that is very important. They don't move in the same ways. Their concerns and their politics may not be the same. So this is something to think about. And finally, to say that Hong Kong is on the outside of things, on the outside of big, powerful empires, right? For example, a perspective on reality from the inside out or the inside or the outside in is to say that a connector, a hub is almost always an insider. When we say that somebody is an outsider and is used to performing that role as an essential outsider, it almost always means that person or that group are insiders. They need to understand both things in order to connect them in meaningful ways. So the inside is also outside, outside can also be inside. So that there's a kind of the quality of being a connector. The Chinese diaspora may be seen as alien and foreign in Southeast Asia, but the fact is they have been there for centuries. They maintain their distinct culture, sometimes, some of the times, and you go look at the architecture and the towns and cities of Southeast Asia, you notice it right away. But they have been there for a very long time. So it's kind of this is what I mean by a perspective from the inside out and the outside in. All right, I think this is all. I think what I've been trying to say is that how Hong Kong itself could be put in dialogue with Hong Kong with diaspora studies, and to see how Hong Kong as a place has always been in dialogue with other places, and migration and diaspora is a way to access those connections and how these connections shape itself. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chen, for your very interesting presentation, especially towards the end when you discuss the insider and outsider dynamic. But before I turn it over to Professor Diana Larry, I just want to remind our audience members that if you have any questions or any comments, just please type them into the chat box. But yeah, please, Diana Larry, Professor Diana Larry, sorry, if you could give your response now.
Well, first of all, Shelly, many, many congratulations on giving such clarity to an immensely complicated subject. I've never heard a better explanation of some of the meanings of diaspora, and that's quite an achievement. But secondly, to say to you, in front of all these young students, or some of them at UBC, what great joy it gives a teacher to see the success of a student. And I've followed your career at a distance, and I can't tell you how proud I am of you that you've achieved so much. But I just want to show you, before I make some comments on your talk, something that you did for us before you left UBC. I don't know whether you can see it or not. Shelly, one of Shelly's first publications was a collection of all of the Chinese organizations in Vancouver and in Canada in general. And that came out when I think you were still just starting your MA. And it showed a way in which communities hold together, because this is what you were looking at then, the myriad lives of a community, and the mentioning that many people who'd migrated, at that point it was mainly from Hong Kong, who tied themselves together with these community organizations. Since then, it's expanded dramatically, of course, but even then you saw how diaspora actually worked in itself. Now, as for the comments, I could spend an hour, but I'm not going to, because that would be extremely boring for everybody. But I do want to mention several things that really stood out to me in your talk. First of all, the complexity of using the word Chinese. And I was very glad that you're talking about using either parts of China or Hong Kong almost separately on its own. One of the reasons people are leaving now is because China is exerting such heavy pressure on people to forget about having a regional or a local association, and to force people to be patriotic, on and on, force them to speak Putonghua. Beijing hasn't learned very much. They've been trying to crush Cantonese, the Cantonese language, not only in Hong Kong, but on the mainland for more than 70 years. And it's still an immensely vibrant language spoken by an enormous number of people, far more than many smaller languages in other parts of the world. Secondly, what impressed me very much by what you had to say was the sense, the complex emotional issues involved with migration or remigration, the separations, the nostalgia, feelings of alienation, feelings of failure. Often people who think they're going to succeed in migration don't. Feelings of having maybe almost betrayed people they left behind. And I'm so glad to see you stressing that, because that is in a way what impels migration. In some ways, it's not just trade routes and whatnot, it's people migrating because they're either frightened or because they have something that they feel they're going to gain or something they've got to escape from. And these are all essentially emotional responses. So as I say, I was very glad to hold that, to see that. Thirdly, one conflicting issue which cross-cuts all of the issues to do with diaspora, and one which has come up again and again in the last few days in the context of the Olympics, citizenship. How does we used to have the most wonderful expert on citizenship at UBC, Maurice Copperthorne, who's unfortunately no longer with us, but the complexities of both Canadian and Chinese citizenship, and American for that matter, have just been underlined by the two dear girls who went to perform for China. One of whom did give up her citizenship, one of whom almost certainly hasn't, but is acting illegally, therefore. Then you find the two Chinese hockey teams, men and women. Both of them, I was astonished to hear, were over 50% Canadian. Now, I don't know the players actually were, but did they give up their citizenship? There's a lot of things to be sorted out, but it does very much complicate the question of diaspora, because citizenship, either obtaining or giving up citizenship, is immensely complicated. And even really good lawyers, which Maurice was, find it difficult to deal with. On a happy note, I'm pleased to say that the late lamented Caspar Tsui, who was forced to resign over Partygate, himself abandoned his Canadian citizenship. So he has gone down without any stain on Canada. Finally, another complication, absolutely fascinating to me, is language. How do you maintain language in the diaspora? Spoken language is sometimes easier. Written language is much more complicated. And again, to go back to the Olympics, the poor skater who fell has been castigated for not being able to read and write Chinese, which growing up in California, she probably didn't feel the need to. So maintaining high levels of language is really hard, and it affects very much how people feel about their connection to where they came from. I remember, this is a funny little example, but it always stood in my mind. I was standing with a Canadian Chinese friend of mine in Beijing, and somebody came up to her and said, 是不是你第一次回国? So I translated it for her into English, because she didn't speak Chinese. And the man was so astonished, he practically passed out. But it was she was Chinese, I clearly wasn't. But I think she could have managed in Cantonese, but certainly not in Beijing. So there are all these sort of odd and complicated issues attached. But I want to end by saying that we're talking about Hong Kong today, and breaking my heart to see the really awful COVID spread that's going on there now. And to see that coming on top of the separations and the people leaving, and to know that nobody could leave at the moment at all. You can't basically get in or out of Hong Kong at the moment. It's cut off, physically cut off from the rest of, not just the rest of the world, but also from China. They're arresting people in China who've come from Hong Kong, tracking them and arresting them and putting them in quarantine, not arresting them criminally, but to put in quarantine. So I can only say, my thoughts and prayers that this awfulness will pass soon. But in the longer run, Shelly, I'm expecting much, much more for you, because I can see how ready you are to do really, really interesting work. And thank you again so much.
Thanks, Diana.
Thank you.
That's very generous. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Larry. Professor Chen, do you want to give a quick response to
Sure.
Dr. Larry? Maybe just keep
Yeah.
it to like 2-ish minutes.
Yeah. So I've mentioned how diaspora is only one of the ways one may use to describe movements, right? But you can see movement is in the DNA of Hong Kong very much, right? So the present lack of movements is something very unnatural to experience, I think, for a lot of people who live in Hong Kong. And I think historically, we could also understand that, you know, kind of it's one of the most universal experience to move. Actually, to not move actually is could be seen as quite unnatural if we flip the kind of interpretation, because a lot of the biases and the assumptions that we have come from nation state being the most normative kind of container for geography, for chronology, for experience, for agency. And so I think something is always missed if we take that as our only center for analysis. So I think, yes, so movement is written kind of in the DNA of Hong Kong people, and therefore making diaspora, that it has a way to kind of interpret some of the things that's going on, but not all things. Language, I'm just kind of doing things in reverse order. I think if you're familiar with Sinophone studies, language is a really important component of a kind of non-diaspora approach to culture, which is that it will be decoupled from whether one identifies or can be identified as Chinese, but just being on the fact that whether the person speaks or writes in a Sinitic language. So maybe that person speaks Cantonese, maybe a person speaks Hokkien or Teochew, or can write in the Chinese written language, right? That would qualify them as somebody who could potentially produce Sinophone culture. So I think scholars are quite sensitive to all of these things, how something matters to me, because I'm a historic migration. I need diaspora. It's about the social experience of moving. So and identification with an imagined or real homeland can survive in a lot of ways. In food, for example, home cooking is often a way how people feel connected to a homeland. That is how the recipe comes from a certain family, and this type of food is still being cooked. Or bubble tea, for example, is experience that is proliferating kind of in lots of places, even when it's already out of fashion in the place where that it originates, and comes back and revive it again. So I think diaspora does have a role to play in kind of spreading some of this homeland culture and mixing it with others, right? And developing different sorts of flavors that other people love. So it survives in other ways other than language. But language is important in some, depending on what question you ask.
Maybe just quick, is it completed?
Just the last thing about citizenship, I think that is certainly one way to understand, how to classify someone, right? If that person is Canadian or American. And I think it's important not to confuse diaspora consciousness or identity with racism, that because then risks, I think there's a certain tension, right? Sometimes with regard to an identity or politics of identity. But I think diaspora is useful in a way that it captures anything that was left out or got reshaped by ideas of citizenship. Citizenship does not explain everything of one's roots and routes. And I think, so we at certain times, I think diaspora can be useful in revealing something that is hidden or marginalized.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Chen, and thank you, Dr. Larry, for your I guess, response and Dr. Chen's response to the response. But now we'll move on to the questions and answers. There are a lot of questions, and a few of them are very detailed, which is great for the speakers, but not as great for me. So I will start off with the shorter questions, actually. And they are kind of questions that are just raising up more considerations for diaspora. So I'll just read out 3 of them because they are kind of interrelated, and then Dr. Chen, you can see whichever one you want to respond to. Ronald Tang writes a question for the speaker: to what extent can the idea of identity as choice shed light on understanding what diaspora in Hong Kong's current situation means? Jingyi asks, I'd like to ask a question about what your criteria is for defining Hong Kong diaspora compared to Chinese diaspora. And Susanna Ng asks, if a person of a diasporic community has in the back of their mind that they would like to return one day, then what is the difference between the concepts of diaspora and sojourners? And yeah, Dr. Chen, I'll just let you pick and choose whichever one.
Sure. So identity as choice, I'm aware of that. I think we all like to be seen as belong to something that we identify, that we approve of. But often identity does not, is not just only that. So we often have to contend with other forces that impose on us or define the conditional possibilities for us, what can be recognized, right? So I think there's a real tension and contradiction between identity as choice and identity as something that's more imposed or determined. So I think identity is often a process, right? It changes through our life stages. Just like the women that I talked about, you know, she never thought she would have to bring her children, just like her father brought hers, but them. But it's the times, right? It's she's being forced to make that kind of decision. So I think we're often the kind of, I think historians think a lot about contingency and things are unexpected popping up, and then we have to respond to it in the best way possible. So I think identity is also one of those things that is not immune to these other forces. However, we like to protect it. And I understand, you know, in a lot of, you know, struggle for, say, racial justice, social justice, we are making that choice. We are saying we belong here. And I think that's definitely one of the, you know, kind of things that happen, right? And that's important. But the identity is a very complex situation that is just, there's so many forces that could shape it and limit our choices. So I think I would leave it at that. How to distinguish between a Hong Kong diaspora and a Chinese diaspora? I think at the moment of departure, you know, if someone see and remain deeply connected with Hong Kong, see themselves as such, then of course this is, you know, they see themselves as a member of the Hong Kong diaspora. And I think these things, as they go to other places and meet other people who had come at different times, right? They might be 5th or 6th generation and no longer see themselves as part of this thing. Or they came in the 90s, you know, kind of children of immigrant families like myself. They might feel a different kind of affinity, or Chinese diaspora that comes from, say, other places in China or in Taiwan. They might feel like they are part of a community. That could also be a possibility. So it's not always easy to differentiate, I think. And from the point of view of an outsider, you're all Asian people, so they might even, it's really hard for them to tell one from the other, right? So I think that might be my answer for that. So I forgot what the last question is.
Well, the last one, I think you kind of touched on it, but it's what is the difference between the concepts of diaspora and sojourner?
Oh, okay. Yes, the sojourner, I think, is most often associated with Professor Wang Gengwu's scholarship that sees, kind of the phenomena of coming and going, not being permanently settled, not yet quite local or citizen. And so he's working off, writing, kind of thinking a lot from the situation of Southeast Asia, where all of these new nation states popped up only after the Second World War and been through the very difficult processes of decolonization. I think that fits that context that he was thinking about, and the moment when these nation states make demands on their people to be citizens, your loyalty belongs to me only, or that we also exclude you because we think you would be disloyal. And I think he's speaking to these very powerful forces at the time, and that needs to distinguish who is sojourner, that whose belonging and loyalties belong to somewhere else, and who are the bona fide citizens. And sometimes this choice is not left to the people; it's decided for them to also, in the history of Malaysia or Indonesia. So, that's I think I'm trying to work off from a different context and maybe trying to broaden it out, and also being very careful and mindful of the potential distortion. Kind of, if you use that so liberally, then you risk kind of like misrepresenting phenomenon and peoples. But I just want to kind of be very specific and not forget about the kind of diversity of experiences where diaspora can be useful and where it would not be all that useful.
Thank you. I'll move on to two more questions, and they kind of come from your book, actually. So Dr. Wu wrote a question. Following the news reports about post-2019 Hong Kong and the experiences of Hong Kongers you discussed, do you consider that a manifestation of this diaspora moment? And if yes, is this manifestation somehow similar to or different from other diaspora moments? And Shanna Yi wrote, I have two related questions. In Diaspora's Homeland, you talk about how the diaspora invented the idea of modern China and nationalism. I wonder if you could say more about the role of Hong Kong, how the role of Hong Kong plays in these days in the types of in the type of invention. For example, how does it reproduce or disrupt Chinese nationalism? Secondly, could you speak a little bit about how the nation-state, city-states imagines its diaspora, and what kinds of new relationships could this imagination generate or prohibit?
Wow, these are great questions. And I worry I don't have enough time to really tackle them well, but I'll do my best here. These are really, really thoughtful, sophisticated questions. Thank you, everyone. So is this moment a diaspora moment? I think in some ways, yes. What I was saying, the timetable, right, with Hong Kong's integration, or some would say reintegration with China, Hong Kong existing on its own temporality. It was a former British colony. It was nothing before. It predated PRC. It has its own track of development, and it was outside of the Chinese mainland. But the post-1997 situation was to kind of try to integrate them, right? And it was supposed to go on a certain timeline. And at some point, that timeline was lost, was given up. And there is the squeeze of that integration had to happen now. So I think this is something that I always try to capture in the book, that suddenly there's acceleration of temporality where these different temporalities, they intersect, and one is forcing the other for a response. So I think in some ways that China's, the unification between China and Hong Kong has kind of led to a moment, a rather contentious moment of diaspora right now, that it draws a lot of attention, and demand is impinging on our present moment. And the other way to think about it is that Hong Kong has been producing its own diasporas historically, right? So not just at the present moment. If we were saying the present moment, maybe it has even been happening for a number of years, not just in the last couple. So I think there's another way to think about Hong Kong itself is the homeland for these different diasporas, instead of thinking about its relationship, which is the most important relationship, that is the one with China. The second question.
The second question is—
I should be taking notes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, these are very good questions, very long questions actually as well.
Yeah.
But the second question is, I'll just read it out verbatim. In Diaspora's Homeland, Chen talks about how the diaspora invented the idea of modern China nationalism.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak more about the role Hong Kong plays here and the creation of this.
Yeah. So I'm certainly aware of the support that has been expressed for the Hong Kong protest met with resistance and pretty kind of serious pushback from other members of the Chinese community in many places. So that is the complexity that we need to remember all the time, that just by saying, they all see whether it's Hong Kong or China as their homeland or some shared culture, or in some ways, they don't necessarily agree with each other. So there is this, these differences, political, cultural, historical, that separate them. So I think what interests me is that what sometimes cause these differences to melt down and disappear and kind of vanish, or there are these cleavages within the diaspora itself that was generating new things. So divisions is also kind of fragmentation is also a part of that dynamic about diaspora that I talked about, and often just as important to remember that just as we think, Hong Kong or China itself are not homogeneous entities, we need to think of diaspora the same ways without making everything plural. That diaspora itself is internally differentiated. Sometimes parts of them, kind of these boundaries or these differences soften, and it became a powerful force. Sometimes these differences matter a great deal.
Thank you. I think we might be running out of time, but I think we can push for one very quick question before I turn it over to Dr. Shin. Rachel Wong writes, if diaspora is the feeling of being outside of the real or imagined homeland, can we propose that diasporic moments do not begin from the physical movement of individuals, but from the moment when the sense of unfamiliarity emerges, when one feels alienated from their homeland?
Yes, absolutely. I think when you feel alienated from an imagined homeland, a real imagined homeland, then maybe you don't think of yourself as part of this diaspora, or maybe you do. Right? Maybe you're drawing that attention to that difference of just I'm outside of it, that this concerns me no more. So I think that can exist.
All right, thank you, Dr. Chen. I'll turn it over to Dr. Shin to conclude us.
Okay, conclude that sounds so. Anyway, it's wonderful. I know that we couldn't get to all the questions, so I apologize for that. We'll save the chat. We'll send it to Shelly, so Shelly will have a record of the questions. At times, Shelly, it does feel like it is almost like a dissertation defense, right? These are great questions. These are in some ways impossible questions to answer. Give me your 30 seconds response, right? But these speak to the complexity of the issues, but also the many points that you have raised in your talk. I like the way you talk about positionality. If I have to ask a question, but I won't, but the tension between diaspora and diaspora moments and how they make each other, that's that leads to many questions. But I thought that's a very interesting and useful way to think about it. So anyway, I think I should also bring it to a close. But I would first of all like to remind the audience, thank you for staying with us. But I would like to remind the audience that there will be 2 City Reassembled events coming up in March. The first being a film screening plus conversation with the director, our very first in-person event in 2 years. So we are tiptoeing back to physical events, but we are also going to keep on having online events as well. So in March, we are going to have another talk by this time by Professor Gordon Matthews from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And I noticed that there are many questions today about identities, and this is a talk that that I think many of you would be interested. So stay tuned. If you're interested, you can go to our website to find out more details. I would also like to remind the audience that Professor Chen has kindly agreed to stay behind just for just a few more minutes, in case some of you would like to chat. I know that it's Friday afternoon, we should all be going for dinner, but Dr. Chen is very nice and would stay behind for a few more minutes, so stay behind if you are interested. So with that, I would like to thank the audience for joining us. Thank you. I would also like to thank Sonia Kong, our super duper student assistant, for designing the poster and taking care of all the logistics for the event. I would like to thank my dear colleague, Professor Diana Larry, for taking the time for reflections and insights. Thank you very much, Diana. I would like to thank Ryan's son, for his expert moderating. Excellent. And of course, I would like to thank Professor Shelly Chen for the many fruitful thoughts. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.